So, good morning, Poppy. My name is Phoenix. I'm a first year PhD here at Cambridge, and this is a great opportunity to speak with each other, learn a bit more about working in the development sector and humanitarianism. But we'll just kick off. I'll just ask you to introduce yourself a little bit, tell us exactly what you do.
So I'm Poppy. Thank you for approaching me. I work for Save the Children UK and I work in their financing team. So I help raise funds for the programs that we do in different countries. So the way that we work is that we are divided up regionally. So I am covering Middle East and Eurasia, which obviously with the Ukraine crisis is quite busy at the moment. And I also cover East Africa. So then there are other people working on West Central Africa, Latin America, Caribbean. And basically we raise funding from large scale institutions like the EU, like DFID, like USAID, and then that financing goes to the programs.
That's interesting. Did you have a finance background or did you have like the regional expertise that brought you to this role?
So no, I have the proposal writing background. So I write the projects in line with the teams in country. So it doesn't all just come from us sitting in the UK. Obviously, we discuss with partners on the ground and our country offices that are actually implementing the programs. And so I do the writing part. So writing kind of what we want to do, what the activities would be, how much that's going to cost. But the finance side is done in coordination with financial specialists because we're talking quite a high scale of funding with these grants. So it's sort of from 5 to 10 million pounds or 10 million US dollars. So obviously they have quite big budgets associated. So obviously that goes through quite rigorous financial checking. So not all on my shoulders. And yeah, so that's the role. So the way that projects are financed, I mean, it depends organization by organization, but we get money from the large institutions. We also get money from trusts and foundations, which are normally slightly smaller scale. So you might be talking the kind of 100,000s to early millions, and then we get individual donations. So normally when you're looking for a role in fundraising, you'll sometimes see roles for individual giving or for what's called supporter services, and those would be relating to individuals or like small companies that give small scale grants to an organization. So that's not my side of things. Then often you find roles for a trust and foundation position, and that's someone who would be applying for money from and then working with trusts and foundations. Again, that's not my role, but there's many other people in the organization that do that. And then my role is what's often called large scale grants or institutional fundraising. So if you're looking to get into an organization through a fundraising position and kind of dealing with writing the projects and following up on the projects that are happening, those are kind of the three streams.
I hear a lot of teamwork and collaboration and a lot of moving pieces that you're not a part of that, but I'm sure there's so much kind of interweaving and going between those departments. Okay, so I have three questions that I'm excited to ask you, and my first one is, I recognize it's really difficult, especially now, to enter really any job market, but especially the development sector. So I'm just wondering, maybe from your experience or what you've seen in colleagues, what is it that makes someone stand out? Is it the application? Is it the CV? Is it interviewing? What's kind of that, quote unquote, foot in the door?
So this is very interesting because I entered the sector 11 years ago. So obviously things have changed a little bit. I mean, when I first decided to get into the sector, so it's the only sector I've ever worked in, people can transition from working in private sector to charities, or we get people who have been teachers previously that want to come across and do something in the NGO sector. But for me, it's all I've done. So that's since graduating. So I did a master's in international conflict analysis with a focus on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So then I went to Palestine and I worked for an NGO there, a research-based organization that deals with mapping of settlements in Palestine. And I think it was just my willingness to go overseas was probably one thing that stood out, willing to go into a difficult region of the world, kind of flexibility. I did start as an intern, and that unfortunately is still the way often that people do get into the development sector. So it was a paid internship. So I did have my flights covered. I also had an apartment for the 6-month period that I was working there, and I got a small stipend, but I did obviously have to provide my own kind of resources around that. It wasn't quite enough to live off. But then I think I was luckier than some that internship then was transferred into a full-time paying job after 4 months. So 4 months into the internship, the organization decided to keep me. And so then I was on a full salary. And then from that point, I never went back to being an intern again. So I then I went to Somalia after that, and I worked with an INGO in Somalia, and that was on a salary. And then I was put on what was called a deployment roster, which is another way to get into the sector. Normally after you've had a couple of years experience already in a field office or a field location, you can be put on what's called an emergency roster. And that's where you are deployed to a crisis within the first 24 to 72 hours of the crises hitting. So different organizations have different rosters. Mine was through the Caritas network, but you can join a UN roster, for example, or Save the Children. We have a roster of deployable staff. So you can be based anywhere in the world, and you obviously do work when you're not being deployed. So you can support on proposal writing, you could support in HR, you can support with the administration of the charities kind of running. But then when a crisis happens, you get called up. So I had a position on a roster for almost 3 years. And so in that time, I was deployed to northern Syria at the beginning of the Syria crisis. And then I was deployed to DR Congo when they had internal displacements. And then I was deployed to Sierra Leone in the Ebola crisis. That one actually got extended. So I was in Sierra Leone for 8 months. Normally you stay for 6, but sometimes in exceptional circumstances, depending on the nature of the crisis, you would stay. I got deployed to the Philippines after Typhoon Haiyan. And then I was deployed to, I think that was my main ones. Yeah, I think that was my main deployment. So what normally happens is once the crises hit, and it becomes what's called like a category 1 or 2 response. So there's a significant loss of life, or there's a significant natural disaster, or there's a significant displacement in a population. Then you get deployed, and you're part of the emergency response team that sets up the first phase of response. So you help organize local organizations, local field teams, to do distributions, to carry out the first phase of response, which will often be providing shelter, distribution of water, food, kits for if it's like in a winter context, like blankets, coats, etc. And then work on raising finances in country to like scale up your project. And then you leave and hand over to the more permanent team. So that was kind of how I got into it. So I think everyone's personal circumstances are unique, but I was lucky at the time that I had that flexibility to travel. I didn't have any commitments that kept me needing to be in a kind of like more permanent role in one country. So I was able to kind of move from location to location and support in that way. I always said yes to my deployments. I always kind of kept myself available, and I really enjoyed the work. For me, that was not like a permanent solution. And I think for lots of people, that won't be a permanent lifestyle, because one, it's a quite unsettled life, and also it can be quite high stress. So they often advise that, you know, if you're on a roster, that you do then take a break to do a more kind of settled desk-based position, which is what I did. So then I settled back in Lebanon, in Beirut, working as a program manager for an emergency education program for Syrian refugees. So setting up non-formal education centers for Syrian refugees who aren't able to enroll in public schools. So they're not actually legally given the right to be in the public schools. So we would set up alternative education centres to teach basic literacy and numeracy. And I program managed that from one country for 2 years. So rather than jumping about, it was a more kind of settled position, still based like in the context of the work being done. So visiting the schools, monitoring them, like ensuring that the project was running correctly, but not quite as flitting around in the first phase of disaster. And now I'm based back in the UK doing the proposal writing side of things.
Wow. I think what I get really excited about with development work is it, even though it's considered its own sector, you just mentioned education, you mentioned health, you mentioned, economy. It really brings everything in together. So having that flexibility, like you said, is necessary, but I imagine very, very tiresome after, if in 24 hours you're someplace new for the next six to 8 months, that can be exhausting with lack
Yeah,
of
and I would say it depends on, like, not everyone needs to, this is only a small portion of the
Mm,
development of humanitarian work. So when you're asking like what makes someone stand out, I think it really depends what they want to do. Because if you want that lifestyle where you're excited by the idea of travel, to be directly like seeing the impact of the work and like physically contributing to the work on the ground, that can be like a very good option. It can be very rewarding, dynamic kind of role. But equally, if you are humanitarian, let's say you're driven by humanitarian principles, you like the idea of working in the charitable sector, but maybe it's not for you, you wouldn't like that lifestyle, or you have other commitments or things that would stop you from traveling. There's so many other ways you can contribute to the general humanitarian effort. Like, you can do desk-based work in monitoring and evaluation, for example, so improving the quality of humanitarian responses by reviewing what's been done in projects. How could it be improved? How could money have been better spent? How could the work have been done in a quicker, more timely, more effective way, for example? And you can do a kind of more research-based role. Or you can do what I'm doing now. I have very little travel in my role now that I've got young children. I do proposal writing. So I could do my job from anywhere really, and I write proposals in coordination with teams to raise money for the charity. That's a very like valuable job. Or you could be working in communications, updating social media accounts, producing reports and like feel good human stories about the work that the charity is doing. So there's really many avenues, but I think in general you should be committed to humanitarianism. You should see it as a vocation, I think, more than a job, because I don't think I know anyone who works from 9 to 5 in humanitarian organizations. I think definitely being committed to diversity and inclusion, that's incredibly important. Like, you'll be working with very diverse populations, different cultures, different religions, different sects, different types of people within an organization, which is really fantastic and exposes you to different people. But you need to be very like open to that and sensitive of people's situations and backgrounds. I think you need to really be committed to like safeguarding vulnerable people and like appreciating people's like backgrounds and the situations they've gone through, and be a compassionate person. So I would say those would be like the key qualities that would make you stand out in an interview.
yeah. Hopefully those are qualities you see in a lot of roles, but absolutely here. You've kind of beat me to my next two questions, but so
Oh,
you
I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
no,
I'm,
it's
I'm
great.
chatting on. Carry on.
Well, you've already kind of mentioned all the different jobs from finance, proposal writing, in the field, desk-based, etc. So, all of these because you're in it and you see the different roles come together. How does someone from the outside or someone just learning about the sector, how do they learn about all these different roles? And then how do they kind of find the one that's going to be the best fit for them?
So I would say that there's a number of resources you can look at, and I'm happy to share these with you. I don't know how you share this on this YouTube series. I'm not that techie to put a link on, but there is basically something called the Kaya e-learning platform, which is actually part of Save the Children UK's work, but it's open for everyone. You don't need to be part of Save UK to use it. So I can share the link with you. Anyone is free to sign up for an account and then to start looking through courses. But it basically has a number of introductory e-learnings and materials about how to enter the humanitarian sector. So we have like a volunteers essentials learning pathway, which kind of gives you the essential skills and requirements to be a volunteer overseas. We have what's called the humanitarian essentials course, which kind of gives you the main principles and policies of humanitarian response. So you can kind of learn the basics, let's say, that way. And even through just searching through the filter on this, like a library of courses and resources, you'll kind of get a sense of program management or finance roles, or you kind of see what's out there. Another very good place to look is called Relief Web. So it's a jobs and training site, and many NGOs in the UK as well as overseas post jobs on there. So you can filter by kind of entry level positions, by years of experience, and by theme. So for example, if you're studying an education degree at Cambridge or whichever university, you might want to search by education, sort of entry level position, and it will show you what is in that sector. So there might be proposal writers for education projects. There might be, for example, education advisors. So someone who could go and advise overseas on the best practice in education. So you can sort of see, like, depending on your interests, I think it's always worth approaching anyone you know who works in the sector to have a conversation, to ask about the different roles that their organization offers. Some larger entities still offer sort of paid intern programs. So I think there's like the Junior Officers Program of the United Nations, which is sort of a chance to enter the UN system and then be seconded into different departments to see how their different departments work over, I can't remember what period of time, to be honest, whether it's 1 or 2 years. So that would be my main sort of advice. And I think also volunteering, if you can, while you're a student, is really great, because obviously once you're sort of out there in the world and, you know, depending on your financial circumstances and needing to support yourself, it is quite hard to be a lowly paid or an unpaid intern or volunteer. But if you can do something alongside your studies, that could be recommended. So for example, when I studied my master's, I actually volunteered at a UK-based charity called the Mediation Service, which mediates between young offenders and the victims of their crime. So it's not exactly international humanitarian response, but there's some transferable skills you can learn there. So kind of, I wrote funding proposals while I was there, which can be transferred to an international context. I worked with vulnerable people. Again, that can be transferred. So I would definitely see what's like in your local area and what local charities are existing, because that can help kind of build your CV.
Yeah, like you said, that again, working with someone, you learn what it's like to be that compassionate mind, and that's going to help you anywhere. Great. So you kind of had mentioned that you don't know anyone who works 9 to 5. You're talking about, you know, working with you know, the young perpetrators, like you just said. Those are some heavy things, and there's, I've heard it, and a lot of us have probably heard it, this trope of the burnt out do-gooder. You know, you're in the development work and maybe you, for 5 years, 6 years, not that long, and then you kind of need that break. And you kind of already mentioned that in some of your more high intensity roles, it was then suggested to do something a little bit more stable. So what do you do now that, you know, helps you balance that work life system, or what boundaries do you find easier to set in your work, and what ones are still kind of difficult to set?
Well, I think that's a really good question. But I think also the sector has really come on leaps and bounds with this, because, for example, like 5 years ago, we didn't know what was wellness, if I'm being honest, or at least in any of the roles or agencies that I'd worked for. You know, there might be like a counselling hotline, but it was maybe not very well promoted or used by staff. But now there is, especially since COVID, and people kind of really having to change their working patterns, some of the stresses of also like being stuck at home and juggling childcare and homeschooling and working. There's been a very big movement within the sector to increase employees' kind of understanding of well-being. So there are now courses that are compulsory to take on your own and your staff's well-being, how to recognize the signs of stress, how to report when you see staff under stress, how to apply for and take leave if you're feeling under mental health pressure. For example, R&R is called rest and recuperation. So R&R is like a period of time in which you come out of a high intensity environment overseas and you're just relaxing. So for example, when I worked in Somalia, after every 6 weeks I would take R&R to Kenya. So they would take me out of Somalia and then I would like recoup myself in Kenya and then go back again. And to be fair, that policy has been existing for quite a lot of years, but now it's more compulsory that staff take their R&R. It's not for you to have to speak up and say you need it. That is a break within your contract every X amount of time, depending on which country context you're in. Definitely there are more like counselling services, therapy services available to NGO workers. There's a really great organisation called Interhealth, which a lot of the main INGOs work with, they used to sort of be known for vaccinating you before you go overseas, but now they offer not only physical health care, but mental health care as well. So and again, on the Kaya platform, which I mentioned, which is the kind of e-learning resource with humanitarian-based trainings, there are a lot of like psychological first aid and well-being and mental health resources and courses on there. So I think it's good to know those things exist and to access them and to feel the support of your manager and other staff. But I think it's also about yourself taking breaks when you need to. So if you're in like high intensity countries for 2 years, give yourself a break to come back to your home country or to maybe a more stable context, and then go and deploy yourself again, rather than kind of constantly being on the go. And even in myself in this job, which I would say is a lot less stressful than many of the jobs I've done before, even setting boundaries, like I don't have my emails on my phone. So I don't have any of the apps on my phone for work emails. So as soon as my working day is done, my laptop is shut, and then I can enjoy my own kind of personal life. Whereas a couple of years ago, I'd always be messaging back or using my phone in the evening. But even just setting that boundary with yourself can be very helpful.
Yeah, I noticed that even right now as a student, I always think like working over the weekends, I'm going to feel so good and productive. But actually, by the time Sunday afternoon rolls around, I'm kind of wishing I had taken a break. So I think I'm still learning those boundaries myself. So it's good to hear, and it's great to hear that as much of it has to come from the individual, there is that organizational support now. Well, Hardee or Poppy, those were my questions. I was just wondering if you have any last piece of advice or anything else, kind of key takeaways.
No, I just think like we definitely need people in the humanitarian and development sectors. So I mean, I hope I haven't made it sound like scary or too much overwork. I think it's good to be realistic about some of the workload and some of the stresses involved. But I mean, I enjoy this sector. I don't have any plans to leave. I haven't been looking around to get out of the charity or humanitarian sector. I'm happy to stay in it, at least for this next period of my career. I really enjoy working for Save the Children, so I would definitely promote it as a very positive, inclusive organisation, good work-life balance. If anyone was looking for positions in Save UK, I could definitely recommend to look us up. And I think one thing that is really key is languages, actually, which I didn't mention at all. So if you don't speak a second language, I mean, I would recommend taking courses. I don't know if they still do discounts. I don't know what Cambridge University offers, but discounts in kind of second language courses would be really, really helpful, just in terms of like where you're able to work, how you communicate with people in general, like improving your CV. Second languages are often required. It's normally what they call the UN major languages, but again, it depends where you want to work or what context, because every language is helpful depending on the area of the world that you want to go to. But for example, like Arabic, French, English, and Spanish is kind of the main ones. So I would definitely like say do that while you have time, if you have time as a student, because once you start working and you're deployed, it's a bit harder to kind of engage in those lessons and learning a new language, and just keeping an open mind and being positive. That's all I could say.
Great. Yeah, I know here at Cambridge, I'm trying to learn a second language right now. And what is it? It's CULP, Cambridge University Language Program. I know it's CULP, but whatever the P stands for, they have, I think, 14 or some languages. So Arabic and Spanish, I know, are some of them. So, well, that's really great advice. It was really nice to speak with you, and I hope anyone watching this has found it helpful. I definitely have.
Great. Thank you so much.